everyone, welcome back to NebulaTechNews. For today's video, as you can see, I've got a ton of computer components here on my desk. The reason for that is because we're going to be building an entry-level gaming PC. So there's two parts of this video. I'm going to show you guys how to build everything. As we're putting the computer together, I'll explain to you guys what each thing is for, why I chose it, and how much it costs. And then once the computer is all set and assembled, I will be doing benchmarks to show you guys how well it runs with gameplay. So as I mentioned already, this is a budget gaming build. So we didn't get all the most expensive components. Some of these we did get on sale, but I'll go into that a little bit later. And we did spend under $500 for this build. And the reason I went with this particular build, which I'll get into a little bit later, is because it gives you a lot of opportunity for upgrading in the future. So this is great for someone who is building their first PC. If you don't know how, I will show you how to build it. But it's also great if you will have money later on to make improvements to your PC. So again, we spent under $500, so this is for someone who may be on a tight budget now, but you could be someone who maybe wants to upgrade a bit later. All right, and before we get started, I do want to make a note of two things. Number one is to make sure that whatever area you're building your computer on, you have the space so that you're not overcrowding things. So really only use the things that you need. Anything that you don't need, it's always important to just keep it off to the side so that you have a clean and very focused work area. So we're going to be doing that as we build. And number two is to make sure to keep yourself grounded. If you have an anti-static mat, you can use that. So let's get started. Okay, so for starting off our build, the only things that we're going to need on our workbench right now are our motherboard, our CPU, the RAM, and our power supply so that we can get ourselves grounded. In the background right over there, I also have a screwdriver, but I will explain that in just a bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and tell you guys a little bit about the components I chose. So I went with an 8 gig kit of RAM. This is a Crucial Ballistics 2666. So it's not the fastest or obviously the highest amount of RAM, but it's good for a starter PC. We also got the Gigabyte B450m. This actually came up to $62 because it was on sale. I went with an AMD Ryzen 5 1600. That was also on sale and I got it for 80 bucks. So it is super important for you guys to keep in mind that a lot of different retailers and manufacturers will put these on sale very often. So you could get a lot of these items for a budget build on sale from their regular price. And then we've got an EVGA 400 watt power supply, and this power supply was $30. So to get started, we need our motherboard. We went for a Gigabyte B450m chipset, mainly because it's a very good price range and it does give us the opportunity to upgrade a little bit later on. So we wanted something that would be fairly reasonably priced, but that we could upgrade it later once we had, you know, a better build or a budget for a better build. So we're gonna open this up. These are SATA connectors that we're gonna use later on, so I'm gonna put these to the side. What we need right now is our motherboard, which is in this anti-static bag, and then under here, we have our I/O shield, which we're also gonna need. And so now that we've got our I/O shield and our motherboard, we're gonna close this back up. And I actually really like using the box as a anti-static workspace, just because it's easier and I mean, it's right there. So we're gonna put this I/O shield over to the side as well because we don't need that yet. And we're going to take our motherboard out of the bag. And now once you take this out of the bag, you do want to be careful to handle it only by the corners or by holding on to metal or plastic components so that you're not damaging anything else. So now what we need to do is install our CPU. So it's going to go in here. So we're going to take this, pull it out, and pull it all the way up. And now that that's all the way up, we're going to take our Ryzen 5 and we're going to install it here. And you want to be super careful when you're handling your processor because there's a bunch of pins underneath here and you don't want to bend any of those pins. So what you want to do is you want to line up this triangle right here to the triangle here on the motherboard. So the motherboard's got a triangle right down here. So you want to make sure that you line this with that. And then really all we have to do at that point is just drop it into place. You shouldn't have to push it. You shouldn't have to force it. It should just fall right into place and not require any additional effort. So just like that. And then you can always kind of move it around a tiny bit, not with a lot of pressure, just to make sure that it's set in the right place. Once you've got your processor set, we're going to take this and we're just going to close it back down to hold our processor in place. So now that we've installed that, the next step is to install our RAM. So our RAM is actually going to go in these slots here. So what you want to do is you want to open up the second and the fourth slots on your board. And most boards probably won't open on this side, but you can always check. So we're going to open up these slots. We're going to take our RAM. And RAM really can only go in one way, so you want to make sure that this little notch here lines up with where you're trying to put it in on your board. So see, if we put it this way, it doesn't line up, so I just have to turn it, and now it lines up. Now I just put it in the board, and then you're just going to press down firmly on each side until you hear a click. There it is. So now we do the same thing with our other one. We just line it up, place it in, and we just push. Now we're going to move on to put in the CPU cooler. So in order to put in your CPU cooler, you have to remove these here. Most people do this before they put the CPU in. I don't really care, honestly, because they have to come out anyway. So I guess to me, it doesn't really matter when they come in or out. So we're going to take these out. Build, I'm using the stock cooler that came with the AMD Ryzen because it works well enough. Plus we have 5 fans that we're putting into our case, so we should have plenty of airflow. So I'm just going to go with the stock cooler and we're going to install that now. And an important thing to note about your cooler is that it will always come pre-installed with thermal compound if it's a stock cooler. If you bought a separate one, you do have to apply thermal compound onto your processor before you apply the cooler. But keep in mind that this one, since it's a stock one, it always comes pre-applied. We don't have to worry about that. So we want to put our cooler in, and keep in mind that the connector for the CPU fan is right up here. So you want to make sure that you have enough space to kind of tuck this under. So once we have this in the specified slots, we're going to start to tighten. I like to tighten it across. So I do one side a bit and then this side over here, just so that you're not building up too much pressure. So you just want to tighten these up until you start to meet resistance when you're turning, and at that point you're all set to go. So now we've got our CPU fan installed. Now we just have to plug it into the header over here. So make sure that you're lining up this line with the line right over here. All right, so now we've got our fan installed and plugged in. We've got our RAM in and our CPU obviously under the fan. So we're ready to move on to the next part. So the next step now is to install our M.2 SSD. I went with a WD, so Western Digital Blue, 500 gigs, and this was $65. So it's important to remember that some motherboards may have more than one slot to put in your M.2 SSD. So you have to make sure that you're putting it somewhere that's convenient for you. Ours has a super convenient spot right here, and you can actually see it because of this screw here. So we have to take the screw out, and we're just going to put this onto the side because we are going to need this again in just a second. And to install your M.2 SSD, you want to take this slot and angle it in to the slot right here on your motherboard. So you just put that in there, and then you kind of hold it down so that you can put the screw back in place here, and the screw ultimately is what's going to hold it in place. And you really don't have to worry about tightening this too much because it's really not going to go anywhere. The screw is just here to hold it in place. So now that we've got that installed, we are all set to put our motherboard inside of our case. So for our case, we went with this darkFlash DLM21 Micro ATX case. It's got a tempered glass side, which will allow us to see inside, and it is a black and white design. It's super nice. I really like it. So we're just going to take off this tempered glass door so that we can get in there and install our motherboard. Now that we've got the tempered glass panel off of our case, we're going to take our I/O shield and we're going to line it up on the back slot so that we can get our motherboard in place. Now that we've got our IO shield in, and remember, you have to push it until you hear the click on each side. Now we're gonna take our motherboard and we're gonna line it up with our IO shield so that we can get it in the case. And the other important thing is to make sure that those standoffs right there, and there, and there's two more underneath, that those standoffs line up with the standoffs on your motherboard. If they don't, you would have to add some in, and these parts actually come with your case as well. So it comes with little standoffs that you could put in. Thankfully, my motherboard and the standoffs inside the case match up perfectly. So now we're gonna install the motherboard. So now we just have to screw our motherboard into place, and all of the screws that you're going to need come with your case already. So any standoffs that you might need, additional ones, or the screws for your motherboard will come with your case. So make sure that you check for those. So we're just going to install those right now. And so the next thing that we want to do now that we've got all of this in our case, as you can see, I started to route some of my cables around for where I'll have to plug them in, and that'll just make it easier for cable management so that you don't have a big mess. But before I get finished with routing all of my cables, I do want to put in my fans. So this case has slots right here for the fans with the front intake. It's also got a slot back here, and it also has slots on the top. So I did buy 5 fans, and I'm gonna put those fans in so that we can get everything situated, make sure that I have the connectors for the fan set up where I need them. I'm also gonna put in my power supply and mount it to the case. So for the fans, for this build, I went with Arctic PMW PST, and the model is P12. This is a value pack, so it actually came with 5 of them, and it was $25. And the reason I got these specifically is because they have these connectors that make it so that I only have to use one fan header, but I can connect all of the fans to each other so they're all synced together. Now this particular motherboard only has one fan header that's accessible to me, which is right over here. And so if I were to try to plug in all of these fans at once, obviously I wouldn't be able to. So these are super helpful because I can connect them all to just that one port. Okay, so now that we've got our fans in place, don't mind these little wires, we're gonna do a little bit of cleanup later, but I wanna plug in a few things down at the bottom just so that we can get that out of the way before we put in our power supply and before we put in our graphics card. So this is our USB 3.0 cable. It is labeled actually. So it says right there, USB 3.0. And the part that we're plugging it into is also labeled as USB 3.0, which is super helpful, and I'm not sure if you guys will be able to see it, but it's right there. Okay. So now we've got our USB 3.0 plugged in. I ran the cable down through the bottom because you won't really be able to see it too much, and you don't want to bend it too much because then it'll, just bend right off of your motherboard, so we're not going to bend that too much. Going to give it a little bit of room to curve over. The next thing that we want to plug in is our front panel. So it's going to be all of these tiny little connectors here. Now I'm switching to handheld to show you guys a better view. So if you'll see, I've got my power switch on top. Next to that, I've got my power LEDs. Underneath my power switch underneath the power switch here, I've got the reset. And underneath my power LEDs, we've got the hard drive LEDs underneath. It's just very hard to show because it's really tiny, but underneath all of the pins, there are labels that tell you what goes plugged into them. So it does make it a little bit easier. And they do have labels for positive or negative if you need to know which slot it has to be plugged into. So the next thing we plugged in was our USB, which we've got plugged in right here. And this is our audio, which goes plugged in over here. So I'm gonna route it over. Okay, so now we've got our USB plugged in, we've got our audio plugged in. Next, we're gonna mount the power supply underneath here. So I do have to flip the case because there's an opening on the other side. This actually doesn't come off. So in here, this actually is a 3.5-inch hard drive slot. We're actually not putting a hard drive in here just because we really don't need it right now, just because it's a starter build. But if we ever wanted to improve our storage, we could always add a hard drive here. We also have the 2 SSD slots on the other side that we could put SSDs in. So we do have plenty of storage options available. So now we're gonna put our power supply in here. Make sure that you point the fan downward so that you can get some air coming out of here. And we're just gonna mount it to the back of the case. And then we're gonna take our 24-pin connector, and it actually goes right here. So it's called 24 pins because there's literally 24 pins. You wanna make sure that you connect it properly onto your board. And it does take a little bit of pressure to put this in, so I would just put your fingers behind your motherboard a bit if you can, and just push it into place. Next, we're gonna plug in our CPU power cable, and it's the one that unclips, and it's 4 and 4, so you clip it together. So we're gonna clip that back together, and this plugs in right up here. And we just plug that in right up top here. So we've got our RX 570 here. So we're gonna take this out, we're gonna plug it in. So what we wanna do is we wanna take out these 2 covers back here because that's where our card is going to poke out of. So we're just gonna take those out. So everything is plugged in, everything should be working. We're not closing this panel, so I'm not putting this back on until we make sure that it turns on. So let's make sure it turns on before we do anything else. All right, so plugged it in and we're getting up to the BIOS, so that's good. So now we just have to configure up the BIOS, install Windows, and then I'll show you guys some gameplay. So as you guys can see, we did end up getting about 75 frames per second on this build, which was pretty great. I had originally gotten an RX 560 and then upgraded to a 570 because I still had it in the budget. I then also had to upgrade the power supply, which is another note. So that brought it up to $45. So we were actually $5 over the $500 mark, but overall it's a pretty good build for a beginner. I will be doing some more videos, so let me know down in the comments if you guys like this build or if you have any questions. That's all for this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe.